I'm really happy to be here. Sorry it has to be remotely. I had some minor surgery a few weeks ago, which was planned, and then a sprained ankle I'm currently dealing with, which was unplanned. So I think the fates wanted me to stay put here in Pittsburgh, but I'm delighted to be here virtually to share some of the work that my colleagues and students and I have been working on. This talk is basically a 10-year retrospective on a framework to design that we've been working on and expanding and replicating over the past decade that we call the embedded design framework. And as Michael mentioned, the majority of the work that we've done is in the space of game design, but I'll bring in a few non-game examples here and there throughout the talk as well. I'm happy to take questions at any point throughout the talk. I probably over-prepared material, so we'll see how far we get. But I'm more happy to have a conversation about any of the ideas or examples of projects that strike your interest rather than getting through every single slide I've prepared for today. I'm also happy to have conversations offline about any of these projects or any of the ideas that I'll be sharing with you. All right, so a bit more background on who I am and how I approach HCI research. My background is in social psychology. I have my PhD in social psychology. And I would say my career pivoted from a direction that was heading toward a pretty traditional career in psychology, so more theoretically driven, to a much more applied direction by doing a postdoc in game design at Dartmouth between my PhD and starting as faculty at Carnegie Mellon. And since joining the field of HCI, my work has become much more applied than I ever anticipated it being when I was a PhD student. Given that a lot of the work that we do is basically how to apply psychological theory to designing impactful experiences, but also at the same time using the insights we gain from that research to inform theories of interaction, theories of persuasion, theories of game design, et cetera. The vast majority of my research in my career is focused on narratives and games and the psychology of those experiences and how you can design stories and games or experiences that incorporate fiction or storytelling to some degree for some transformational outcome. And that's the vast majority of the work I'll present today. In addition, in recent years, having worked with students like Joseph Searing, who Michael mentioned, looking at ways of integrating some of these elements of persuasion into the design of interfaces and interactions in non-game contexts in ways that might have an impact on users' experiences. I direct a lab at CMU that we call the eHeart Lab, which is a clumsy acronym that I won't go through, but it's there on the screen. And essentially, most of the projects we work on have this flavor of taking social psychology as a foundation and using it to design impactful experiences, mostly games, but also things like VR experiences, language technologies, et cetera. By and large, all of which have some pro-social outcome in mind. And when I talk about persuasion, I'm talking about some impact that's having on someone's experience, their behavior, their beliefs, et cetera, in ways that are meant to be beneficial to them or to society at large. As I'll mention today, a lot of the work that we do is in the space of addressing bias and marginalization, and understanding how we can design experiences that might address those experiences or help people understand the subjective experiences of members of marginalized or stereotype targeted groups. More recent work has looked at actually uncovering biases in technology and redesigning technologies to support members of marginalized groups. And in general, that's the flavor of the work that we do. It's very much pro-social in nature, has a social justice orientation toward it, which of course means in this current climate, it's largely unfundable, at least from federal sources, but we persist nonetheless. And we try to cultivate the same ethos of inclusion and empathy in the lab culture that we create. I'm lucky to work with a lot of really talented PhD students and faculty colleagues. Here's just a sampling of some of the projects my current PhD students are working on. Some of whom are poised to graduate, others are earlier on, but they're all, I won't go through all these projects, I'll actually be highlighting a few of them throughout the talk. That you can see, if you just see the descriptions here, they have this nature of either centering the experiences of specific groups such as women of color in STEM or immigrant English language learners, or using technology to increase an understanding or to support members of marginalized groups, or more broadly to improve experiences in some way, improving socialization in online teams, for example. But the work I'll present today will focus on a design framework that's guided a lot of these projects and others in my lab in the last decade or so. And essentially, this is a framework that addresses these key questions that we tackle and grapple with in my lab Specifically, how do we go about creating and designing impactful persuasive experiences? And again, this will largely apply to persuasive games or transformational games, but can be generalized to persuasive experiences or persuasive technologies more generally. And that often starts with articulating what the actual persuasive goal is of a given project. What aspect of someone's experience or their emotions or their beliefs or their behaviors or their identities are we trying to change or improve through that experience? We're often guided by a framework that was developed here at CMU called the transformational framework, which takes you through every step of articulating what your persuasive or transformational goals might be if you're in the space of persuasive design. And I use this as part of my work, but also use this as part of my pedagogical practice as well. I teach courses at CMU where I instruct students on how to create persuasive technologies using a lot of the same methods that we use in my lab. And one key sort of tension that we often grapple with in our work, especially in designing persuasive games or immersive experiences, is how to balance the often competing goals of engagement and immersion and persuasive impact, especially if we're dealing with pretty serious or weighty topics like bias or marginalization. And the framework I'll present today is sort of our approach or our attempt to resolve that tension in ways that allow us to create immersive, engaging, enjoyable experiences that nonetheless have persuasive impact in actually changing the target behavior or belief or mindset that our design is meant to do. And we're trying to think more and more about how we can generalize these methods to non-game context and how they might guide the design of many forms of persuasive technologies. So as a starting premise for the framework I'll present today, we know from over a century of research in psychology that explicit approaches to persuasion can often be counterproductive. So the more forceful, the more obvious, the more overt an attempt to persuade somebody to think differently or to change their behavior, the more aware someone is of that attempt, the more it can backfire. And one key reason is that attempts to persuade can often trigger what's known as reactance, a very universal defensive response anytime we feel like our own sense of agency or free will is being taken away from us. So it's a psychological state that triggers an automatically defensive response, even if we happen to agree with the position being advocated. If someone is too forceful or overt in their attempt to persuade us, it can trigger this automatic reactance response. Some of the best evidence of this is from research on public vandalism, where signs that are more forcefully written discouraging vandalism actually invite higher rates of vandalism, like the example in the image here. There was a study of signs put in public places like national parks or public restrooms, and the more forcefully written they were, they actually invited higher rates of the undesired behavior. And the psychologists who ran these studies attributed that to a reactance response. In addition, when it comes to designing persuasive games or immersive experiences, the more obvious or overt the persuasive goal is, it can actually disrupt some of the psychological experiences that are conducive to enjoyment. Things like transportation, being absorbed in a narrative or a game, feeling engaged with what's happening in the experience and enjoying it. There's even some work suggesting that if kids, for example, are told that a game they're about to play is educational, it actually creates this mindset that makes them expect the game to be less fun because they're so mindful of the learning goals of the game, the fact that it's associated with learning and classrooms. They have this schema that it makes them feel it's going to be less enjoyable, and they actually enjoy the game less if they're overly aware of the transformational goal of the educational game. And finally, in some cases, the persuasive mechanisms that will lead to change themselves are often better left undisrupted. So if people are thinking too much about the persuasive mechanism that's underlying a specific experience, thinking too much about that can actually disrupt the effect. Some psychological mechanisms or interventions work better if people aren't aware of how they're actually working, if they're allowed to unfold more organically without too much attention put to them. So for all these reasons and more, explicit approaches to persuasion can often backfire. And this might be especially true when you're dealing with topics that might be somewhat weightier or heavier, and also especially important when you're designing experiences that are meant to be immersive and engaging. So for that reason, we developed an approach to persuasive design that we call embedded design, which gives ways of putting in persuasive content or transformational content in ways that are more subtle or have a lighter touch or lighter approach in general. And again, this is motivated mainly by the fact that a lot of these projects that I'll talk about today are ones in which people are asked to confront information that might be somewhat serious, maybe even threatening in nature. Confronting your own stereotypes or biases, for example, can be a threatening proposition for most people. In addition, if you have a goal of encouraging people to understand things in a non-normative way, or to take on diverse perspectives or roles to the experience, understanding somebody else's subjective experience, for example. Oftentimes, that could be more effectively done if you're sort of taking a more subtle approach to the way you're guiding people into that experience. So in general, the embedded design approach gives a variety of strategies for designing persuasive experiences that avoid this trap of being overly explicit or overly forceful in nature, to allow the persuasive content to be experienced more open, with a more open mind, more receptive mindset, and to preserve this balance between engagement and impact that I talked about earlier. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to go through a number of high-level strategies. The number I get through depend on how much time I have, at least 3, perhaps 4. And I'll give you some examples of projects that my colleagues and students and I have worked on to exemplify those strategies, and give sort of a whirlwind tour of some of the examples of these strategies in action and some of the research findings that have emerged from our research. And again, the majority of the examples I'll give are in the space of games, but I try to pepper in some non-game examples here and there as well.
Geoff, you've got a question in Zoom. Do you mind if I?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm very bad at monitoring Zoom.
No, that's my job. Do you want to unmute?
Yes, hi.
I'm really loving being part of this this group. I've been worked through a bunch of universities, including Stanford here, and also MIT and Harvard, and some other relevant ones. Yours as well here at times. But anyway, long story short, enough about me. What I was interested in is just your perspective. I loved seeing that sort of multicolor, a multifaceted framework. I worked at McKinsey before, so we did frameworks for a living. So I loved seeing the framework, like that 9-step. But I had a question about it because HCI is so broad. We dealt with that with MPEG too. When you eventually made it interactive, it did everything. So the question becomes, just in short, what's your prioritization of the sort of physical kinds of things like VR headsets and signs versus the purely, hypothetical ones like a game that's electronic that you barely even have a headset for, or a thing. And then also you have the ones in the middle that are like platforms that really help people get better. So I'm wondering how it applies best across those 3 areas, if that makes sense.
So you're referring back to this transformational framework here that I showed earlier?
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say our approach generally is fairly, at least initial stages, agnostic to the platform or the medium. So essentially we start, as this framework suggests, in articulating what exactly are we hoping to change as a result of the experience. And then we use that first step to articulate and to decide what approach or what medium would make the most sense for doing it. And even if we stick just to the discussion of games, there are countless of genres of games and countless variables that might come into play when designing a game. And we often will think about if we're trying to just change a specific behavior, for example. So if we're designing a game to increase cybersecurity behaviors, what might be an approach that might make the most sense? Would we design sort of a multiplayer game where you're sort of learning specific behaviors and modeling them with each other, or cooperating to solve sort of a challenge? Or is it more effective to design sort of a simulation game where you actually take someone through the steps of enacting those behaviors in order to internalize them? Or is it better to create a totally non-digital experience where people are interacting physically with objects and thinking about the affordances of those types of experiences? So the work we do is often pretty diverse in the mediums and platforms we use, but we often try to think about what affordances are given by, say, a specific platform or specific choice that we make. And sometimes our intuitions are proved correct, other times they're not, and we might pivot to do a different type of approach. But that's essentially how we try to tackle that question. We don't assume technology is always the answer. So some of the examples I'll share today, for example, are purely social games that are played with physical components. There's no digital element to them whatsoever. and that was by design.
Oh, it's fascinating. I mean, security is one of my top fields. I'd love to see that game. That'd be amazing. But I know like social engineering is different than say, hardcore, what to do for, protect yourself. So even there, I could see where this could apply broadly. This is really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question as well.
Yes, sir.
All right. So the first strategy I'll talk about is probably the most intuitive, and I'll spend the least time on, but actually it's quite effective. So this strategy we came to call intermixing. And essentially, this just means if you have a specific topic that your persuasive experience is focused on, you don't need to make every single element of that experience about that topic. You can actually pepper in or integrate some off-topic content. And there could be different reasons why you might be inclined to do this. If part of your goal is to make your persuasive goal less obvious, the inclusion of off-topic content might prevent your user or your player from figuring out the specific goal you had in mind with the game. It might give a mental or emotional break from the topic if it's heavier in nature. So providing some off-topic content might be a way of giving a reprieve from that information, or might be a combination of those factors. But more broadly, intermixing is meant to make the topic of the persuasive experience more approachable and accessible through this interweaving and balancing. So one of the very first projects I worked on that led to this framework in the first place was part of an NSF project in which we were designing games to counteract gender stereotypes and gender bias in STEM domains, science, technology, engineering, and math. And so the first game that we created that led to the initial formulation of this framework was a card game called Awkward Moment. So this is a card game not unlike others in the similar vein, like Cards Against Humanity or Apples to Apples, in which you are submitting cards secretly to a judge who will pick their favorite submission. So in the game Awkward Moment, every round, one player is drawing a moment card that describes a social situation that is happening. So the original game was designed for preteen, early teen players. And some of the moments in the game were drawn from real life experiences of gender bias or gender stereotypes. So, for example, going to the mall and seeing a department store is selling t-shirts specifically for girls that say math is hard, reinforcing a negative, untrue stereotype that girls are less proficient at math than boys. And the other players in the round will have a hand of reaction cards, the green cards, and they'll decide which of those cards they think is the best reaction to that moment. There's actually a third type of card in the game, a decider card that gives sort of a criterion or guideline. And based on that guideline, so it could be something like most courageous or most random or most responsible. And based on that combination of moment and criterion, they'll pick a card from their hand they think is the best reaction, submit it secretly face down to the judge for the round. That judge, once they get all the submissions, will shuffle them up, read them all out, and pick a winning submission. And your goal in playing is to submit as many winning reactions to these moments as possible. So the game is just simulating these social situations. So it was our way to try to increase awareness of gender stereotypes, how they might emerge in interactions, in these environmental or ambient cues, and in people's reactions, or maybe even in your own responses or behaviors. But we found pretty quickly with our playtesting, when we first started developing content for the game, the initial versions of the game, every single moment in the game was about gender stereotypes or gender bias in some ways. And we found pretty quickly that the kids we were testing with quickly tuned out, and it became sort of a burdensome, heavy experience. And so it naturally led us to think about ways of using intermixing, first of all, with the moment cards, to integrate some cards that had nothing at all to do with gender stereotypes, but were nonetheless examples of awkward or embarrassing situations or moments that one might experience. So, for example, a moment might say, you're in the cafeteria and you accidentally sit on ketchup and you get up and everyone sees you, or you're shopping for underwear at the mall and the popular kids come in and they see you with your mom shopping for underwear. So moments that are meant to be embarrassing and thought-provoking, but not related to gender stereotypes. And so once we struck on this approach of intermixing, we found through our informal playtesting that the game was working much better. The kids stay engaged longer. They seem to enjoy it. They seem to have deeper conversations about it. And when these moments about bias came back around, they were more attuned to them and responding to them with more energy and enthusiasm. And that led us to do some controlled experiments comparing different versions of the game that either used intermixing or did not. This was both of the original game, Awkward Moment, and we created a follow-up game for adults called Awkward Moment at Work that depicted hypothetical situations in workplace settings that represented some type of bias or stereotype coming out in people's behaviors. And we ran controlled experiments seeing what effect the intermixing approach had on both the impact of the game and players' enjoyment. And at a high level, we found that the intermixed versions were less likely to evoke reactance responses. So when we measured emotions that players reported experience during play, the intermixed version led to lower levels of negative emotions like frustration or resentment or feeling fed up with the game, and increased their enjoyment of it. So we saw that the intermixing was more effective. So even though there was less exposure to content. So in the intermixed version, roughly 40% of the moment cards were about gender bias in the original game. And about 60% were on off-topic situations. The intermixed version was nonetheless also more effective at reducing players' own gender biases. We used some validated scales from psychology to measure players' perceptions of gender and perceptions of ability in STEM specifically, as well as their motivation to recognize and overcome biases. And we found that the intermixed version was more effective at reducing bias. And there was a direct link between these two outcomes, that the more they were engaged with the game, the more positive emotions they experienced while playing, was directly linked to reductions in gender bias and a perception that it was important to be more aware of bias. So it's somewhat counterintuitive. Less exposure to the focal topic actually led to a much better impact in terms of the gameplay experience, in large part because of this balance between engagement and impact that the intermixing allowed us to achieve. And we replicated this with the adult version of the game as well. We found this very similar pattern of responses. And again, we attribute it mainly to the reduction of reactance. If players were less mindful or less aware that the game had this specific goal behind it, or they might have felt less resentful of the game if the game gave them some of these breaks from thinking about that heavy topic by thinking about other topics, maybe having breaks that allowed for some experience of humor or levity as well. So eventually, when we finally produced the game, we added intermixing in other ways as well. So the decider cards as criteria for responding, we also use intermixing there. So some were meant to be sort of earnest and serious. Others were meant to be more humorous or random. And so that intermixing helped in that regard as well. So sometimes you're actually thinking of the worst possible way of responding to a situation, which a lot of players found satisfying, because also it led them to think about the experience from a different perspective. And in retrospect, it seems like this choice of intermixing also was helpful because we know that moments of bias, including gender bias, often emerge sort of intermittently in our daily experience. We're not constantly surrounded by bias, but if we pay attention, we'll see it emerge periodically in other people's behaviors, in depictions in media, et cetera. And so in fact, the game presents sort of a tapestry of experience as you play it that might actually be more representative of how bias is actually experienced in everyday life. But from a design perspective, the intermixing was quite effective. Since this project, we've used intermixing in a variety of different projects. Another example I'll just talk about briefly is, given that at least one of you has interest in cybersecurity, we developed an intervention to increase cybersecurity behaviors that we called the 30-Day Adulting Challenge. This is a project that emerged from my class and a student picked up and ran with after finishing that project in the class, where we designed a series of daily challenges for young adults. The original version that the students came up with actually fell very much into the same trap that we did with Awkward Moment, where they designed every single challenge to be about cybersecurity. So you might one day be authenticating or using two-factor authentication. Another day you might be implementing a password manager, et cetera. And they found very quickly, like we found with the game, that users tuned out. They stopped using the app after just a few days, realizing this is not very interesting or engaging. They may not have cared much about cybersecurity. So using intermixing, they revamped the design to have the challenges be very diverse. So one day you might be using a password manager, but the next day you might be doing laundry on your own for the first time, or cooking a meal from scratch. So throughout the 30 days, you might have a subset of those challenges be about cybersecurity, but because the intermixing increased engagement and enjoyment, when those moments came up where those cybersecurity related challenges were presented, users are much more likely to engage with them and follow through, and actually led to longer term behavior change as a result, compared to a version of the app that simply focused only on cybersecurity. And of course, we're not the only ones to use this approach. If you've played the app Dumb Ways to Die, it actually uses intermixing brilliantly. You may not even be aware of the fact that this app was designed to reduce the rates of train-related accidents and deaths. And they designed an app, originally sort of a viral video, and eventually a game that depicts these sort of characters that are about to meet grisly ends, and you as the player are trying to prevent that. And the game uses intermixing by the fact that only a small number of the interactions are actually about train related safety. So they reasoned early on that designing an app that's all about train safety would not invite a large player base or user base. So they use intermixing naturally to pepper in those examples of train-related scenarios as part of the larger game experience. And as a result, this game was usually successful, and they found that rates of train-related accidents actually went down dramatically after it became widely accessible and widely used. This was commissioned by the Australian Transportation Authority, and so they naturally gravitated towards using the intermixing approach, again, preserving this balance between engagement, in this case, engagement with a huge user base, and this impact on making people more mindful of their behaviors in train stations and subway stations. All right, so that's intermixing. It's again, probably the most intuitive of the strategies I'll present. It includes balancing the presentation of off-topic and on-topic content. So maybe fighting the urge to make your design entirely about a specific topic that you're trying to address through the experience you're creating. The second strategy is highly related to some degree. So obfuscating is simply finding ways of concealing or being more stealthy in the way you're introducing the persuasive goal or content. And in fact, in some cases, intermixing is an example of obfuscating, like I mentioned. Maybe your goal of intermixing is to prevent your user or your player from figuring out, at least initially, what the goal of the game is. But there are other forms of obfuscating beyond intermixing and other uses of intermixing beyond obfuscating, which is the reason why we separate out these techniques. But obfuscating simply means finding ways of being stealthier about the way you're introducing your persuasive or transformational content. And it could be by the way you're framing or presenting the experience, so the expectations you're setting for people ahead of time, or maybe using some method of misdirection to prevent people from being overly aware, at least as the experience is unfolding, of the persuasive goal. So a second game that we created in conjunction with Awkward Moment, also in the space of trying to address biases and stereotypes, was another card game called Buffalo. This works differently from Awkward Moment. In this game, you're presented with noun-adjective pairs, and you're trying to be the first player in the group to come up with an answer, either somebody fictional or real, living or deceased, that you think fits that combination of descriptors. So if you see British Wizard, you might try to shout out something like Harry Potter or Merlin or Gandalf, whatever comes to mind. And if the players accept that as a valid answer, you collect the cards, and your goal is to collect the most cards by the end of the game. So we can actually play a little bit of this. I put in a few examples of combinations of cards from the game. So if you want to try to type answers in the chat for some of these, so you can see who's the first person to think of an answer. This is basically the way the game is played. So who can think of an inspirational CEO? Yes, see some answers already. Yeah, Sam Altman, Elon Musk. Yeah, absolutely. I think those would be valid answers. I came up with Oprah for this one. This is first CEO that came to mind. Another example, a Mexican artist. We're on the same page there. It's Frida Kahlo. Awesome. How about a tattoo genius? This might be a little bit tougher. Yeah, I think Michael wins. The example I came up with for this one is Thomas Edison, who I learned incidentally had a tattoo, one of his early inventions on his wrist, I believe. So not to spoil the story, but essentially part of the goal of this game is to give you examples of people that might not fit your general expectations. So both the combinations of words that you see and the examples that someone in the group might offer are meant to broaden the way you're representing different categories, like what it means to be a genius or what characteristics a genius might have. Final example is probably the most didactic here, but multiracial superhero. Anyone think of an example here? Yeah, Black Panther or Miles Morales. Yep, perfect. So this is getting more at what we're trying to get at with the game. So we know that from psychology that our brain sort of stores representations of social categories with attributes that are linked to those categories, which might include a preponderance of stereotypes that society might associate with those categories. So perhaps the stereotype that most people have of superheroes, you might be inclined to first think of someone who is Caucasian, for example, and not multiracial. Your your schema, somebody who's tattooed might be somebody who's less intelligent, not more intelligent. So we actually created the decks of cards in ways that would increase the odds of seeing pairs of descriptors that were either counter-stereotypical or maybe less expected, or maybe would fill a knowledge gap that somebody doesn't know someone from. So you're playing this in a group that has a diverse set of identities represented or diverse knowledge bases. You might learn something useful from playing the game. But more broadly, it's meant to encourage you to think more inclusively about these social categories through playing this game, just by be able to name someone who fits the descriptors. In general, we found that the game worked much better if we did not tell players ahead of time that the goals of the game had anything to do with stereotypes or bias. So we compared different ways of framing the game to players ahead of time before they started playing it. And sometimes we told them this is a game that deals with social stereotypes, and other times we used more neutral framing, saying this game is about knowledge of social categories. So which is accurate, but not the full story. And we simply found that not revealing the relevance of the game to stereotypes directly or explicitly before playing led to greater impact. Players enjoyed the game more, and we measured their levels of prejudice after playing. Essentially, we measured how likely they were to use categories like gender or race, et cetera, as a basis for forming assumptions about somebody. And we found a reduction in that tendency, especially if we did not tell players ahead of time this game was about stereotypes. And the main reason for that we found in the work is that if players were mindful that this game was about stereotypes before playing it, they were overly consumed by that when they were playing the game. They didn't enjoy it as much. They were so worried about maybe unintentionally being stereotypical or appearing to be prejudiced in some way that it basically changed the experience altogether. And so allowing the game to unfold organically, and maybe as you played the game, you might start to pick up on the fact that there is some relevance here to cultural representations or stereotypes, but it worked better if you sort of discovered that organically rather than having that at the forefront of your mind when playing the game. So we obfuscated the persuasive goal of the game until afterward. We actually, when we packaged the game and commercialized it, we didn't include the language of stereotyping and bias in the marketing materials or any of the game materials, the rules, etc. But we also included references that players could come to after playing to unpack the psychology of the game, so akin to a sort of debriefing in a psychological study. And so by obfuscating the purpose, we found the game, again, preserved this balance between impact and enjoyment. Yeah, great question. So most of the studies we'll present here are immediate changes or at very least short-term changes. We might, in some cases, we measured follow-up effects to see if the changes, for example, in gender bias persisted, say, 2 to 3 weeks after playing. That's typically the largest scale that we've measured in most of these studies. Of course, these would lend themselves well to longitudinal research. Part of our goal in creating these party games specifically was to make these replicable, repeatable experiences. So if you are a fan of party games, you know that you often will play the same game repeatedly with your friends. So a game like Buffalo has hundreds of cards in the mix. We're hoping that if this game is appealing to your group, you could play it over time. And we would hypothesize at least that the effects would sort of be exponentially larger if you play the game more, because you're going to be exposed to more categories, more descriptors. It might reinforce the general message of being broad-minded and inclusive. But in terms of our actual empirical research, most of the time it's either an immediate effect or, say, a short-term change to see if any immediate changes persist over a few weeks. And mainly that's a logistical question. Sometimes the funding we have often doesn't support longitudinal research, which is really difficult to run. But we think it would be really valuable to measure the longer term impact to see if repeated play does have the effects we would predict. All right. Another example of obfuscation would be an approach that we call delayed revelation. And this applies when there might be situations where there might be something about an experience. And this mostly has been studied in our case in the context of games and stories. So if there's something about a character in a game, for example, that might be somewhat counterattitudinal, maybe alienating in some way or distancing in some way, we can delay the revelation of that aspect of the character until a psychological connection has formed. So if you're reading a story, having a sense of affinity or identification with that character, if you're playing a game and sort of embodying that player character, and then revealing something that if you revealed early on might actually create a sort of gap between the person and the character. This actually emerged in my dissertation research, this first example, where we studied this in the context of written fiction, where we varied the timing of the revelation of an aspect of a character's identity, such as their sexual orientation or racial identity, and found, especially in cases where the identity was different from a person's own identity, that delaying that revelation actually encouraged a higher degree of connection and embodiment, and that led to a lower level of prejudice as a result. So that experience of connecting to and embodying that character to a greater degree, which we call experience taking in this research, of embodying the experience of that character, led to lower levels of either homophobia or racial prejudice after playing it. So this embodiment actually was a key psychological mechanism that led to reductions in prejudice. A more recent example, we had a board game that we were working on, which was unique in that all of the playable characters were women, and specifically princesses. So there's a strategy game called Monarch, in which all of the playable characters are sibling princesses vying for power in their domain. They're trying to take the throne that's being left behind by their mother, the queen. So essentially, what was unique about this is that at the time when we tried to publish the game, a lot of publishers basically said, we can't put this game out in the world unless you have at least one playable male character. You have to have a prince in the mix, or we're not going to be able to publish this. And we wanted to show that we could, if designed carefully and thoughtfully, make this game one in which even adolescent boys would willingly embody this role of their princess character. And one way we did this in our research was to use this method of delayed revelation. So in one study, we randomly assigned boys to play a version of the game where they found out first thing that they were princesses versus revealing that later in the experience after a sense of connection had formed. And we found that simple change of delaying that revelation made all the difference. The boys in the study enjoyed the game more. They reported embodying that role of the princess character, to a much greater degree. And they actually showed reductions in gender bias, at least in the immediate aftermath of the game, where their conception of gender stereotypes changed. They no longer thought about gender stereotypes that might associate women with characteristics like being like less strong than men or less powerful. It actually reinforced a counter stereotype that both women and men can be strong and powerful, and that men can be emotional and women can be emotional, that you shouldn't judge or presume something about a person based on an aspect of identity like gender. So we found that simple method of delayed revelation, because it allowed a deeper connection to form between a person and a character, led to the desired effect of reducing bias in a specific way. Yeah, we absolutely measure enjoyment and fun. There are lots of ways of doing that. So we use both sort of self-report scales, where we ask players to rate the game on different dimensions, including enjoyability. We've included measures of sort of immersion and flow. To what degree is your sort of attention absorbed by the game versus your attention wandering? And we use more behavioral measures. In one study, we measured whether or not players actually voluntarily would play the game again. We didn't just ask them, would you play the game again? We gave them a chance. So 1 week later, when they had a variety of game options, if they would actually play the game again voluntarily. Other times we use more sort of implicit measures. It depends on essentially what aspect of the experience you're trying to get at. So implicit measures might be things like where you might use a more indirect measure to see if the game is having the impact it's having. But in terms of measuring enjoyment and fun, those are typically either going to be self-report scales or some type of behavioral measure that might be an indication that the enjoyment, that the game was enjoyable or a positive experience more than a negative one. We might also measure specific emotions that the game evokes. Sometimes we'll embed the measurement of the impact within the game itself. So one incidental feature of the game Monarch is that at certain points in the game, you can choose to cooperate or compete with your fellow players. And we basically found that if you had this embodiment of your character happen to a greater degree, you actually were more likely to choose the cooperative options in the game. So that's one example of how you might actually embed measurement within the experience And in that case, the players didn't even realize it was part of the study. They thought it was a natural part of the game, which it was, but it was also our way to indicate was there some behavioral change happening. Yeah, so long story short, there are lots of different ways to measure engagement. There's some validated scales from games research that will get at different aspects of fun or different types of fun, including, again, engagement, immersion, enjoyment, the sense of fulfillment, whether it's aligning with your sense of like mastery, your sense of competence, your sense of autonomy, et cetera, or specific emotions, like I mentioned. Yeah, so it goes back to that question of when you're defining your transformational goals, you're often thinking about what types of intervening experiences or mechanisms might also explain the longer term impact or the downstream impact. So you might predict a specific game design choice might, for example, like these examples illustrate, evoke a higher degree of embodiment. So you would measure that in addition to any downstream effect like reductions in bias. But there might also be these intervening steps like measuring immersion and measuring emotions that might explain or why a version of the game might be more effective than another. Yeah, great question. All right. Another way you can obfuscate is to misdirect, which means putting in elements that might serve as red herrings to maybe create a different expectation of what's desired or distract from the persuasive goal, or in some way reframe or shift one's interpretation of their experience. I already mentioned the example with a buffalo, how we use neutral language to describe it. We used a similar approach with awkward moments, where we found that using similarly neutral framing to describe the game, not saying this is a game about gender stereotypes, but saying this is a game about awkward social situations, actually led to higher levels of enjoyment and impact. And again, it's not that we're completely hiding it. We're just not setting up that mental schema or expectation ahead of time. And it's not that it's not obvious as you're playing that the game's about bias, but not having that sort of baggage coming into the experience essentially led to a better outcome. A second example here is somewhat unique in that we were using an approach from psychology called misattribution of arousal. This was a game that was sort of analogous to the goals of Awkward Moment and Buffalo. In this case, we wanted to create a game that would increase scientific curiosity among students from marginalized groups who aren't typically associated with higher levels of competence in STEM. So specifically lower income students, students of color, et cetera. So we created a board game called Outbreak that very intentionally used a very heavy sort of horror theme. So you're playing scientists exploring sort of a haunted laboratory, you're encountering zombies, but at the same time, you're actually doing science. You're forming hypotheses, you're creating sort of ways to test those hypotheses. But we found that by having a strong element of horror and suspense, that anytime kids started to feel anxious about the game, which could partly be due to the fact the game was about science, which might be a topic that was triggering, for example, stereotype threat or anxiety about their ability to do science, they were able to misattribute their anxiety to the horror theming of the game, the fact that it was a scary game about zombies and a haunted laboratory. And we tested this by actually comparing a version of the game that used a horror theme versus a version of the game that did not. And we found that the horror theme allowed for this misattribution to happen. So when we asked kids to explain like how they felt while they played it and why they felt that way, the kids by and large who played the horror version of the game attributed any anxiety they felt to the game itself and not to their own self-belief about their ability to excel in science and conduct scientific exploration. And in fact, it led them to see themselves as more likely to be able to pursue science as an interest after playing the game. They had greater comfort with science and greater self-confidence in science because this element of horror allowed them to misdirect their explanation of their anxiety to the horror theme and not to their own personal anxiety about the game's content. All right, that's obfuscating. So it's finding ways of hiding or delaying the revelation of a persuasive goal. Strategy 3 is probably the broadest and maybe the one we use the most often in our work, because essentially just using games and fictional worlds as a persuasive medium essentially is using distancing. So you're finding some way of creating a psychological distance between a player or a person and the experience of the game, the world that it's set in, the topics, the way that different content is represented in the game. So there are many different ways you can incorporate distancing into design. Simply the use of fictionalization itself, as I just mentioned, is distancing. You might use things like metaphors and symbols to represent real life topics. So one example of this, as a postdoc, we designed a game about public health, where we took modern examples of issues with the healthcare system, like insurance inequities, for example, And we created a game set during the Black Plague that had these analogies and metaphors of modern day complexities and elements of the healthcare system. And we found that this distanced, more metaphorical representation of the topics was more effective, that players learned more from it, and they found it more engaging. Hyperbole would be presenting an exaggerated version of reality. So again, maybe having an absurd version of reality that's meant to make a point about a social issue or topic, or using humor of some type to represent these topics. All these are ways to give some degree of safety through distancing to allow people to confront or think about more sensitive or uncomfortable topics, again, like bias. And this use of distancing in games stems from a classic philosophical concept called the magic circle that states that when you enter into the world of a game, you're sort of succumbing and surrendering to the reality that's been created for you. And so there might be rules and norms and experiences that might be quite different from the ones you're used to in your daily life. So the games themselves give you some level of distance from your own reality or the reality of the world that you experience. And for that reason, games naturally create this mindset that's more receptive to taking on new perspectives, new roles, new ideas. So games could be designed specifically to create some alternative version of reality that you want people to experience or to consider. It's the basis for using, for example, speculative fiction in HCI to imagine different realities or futures when it comes to people's interactions with technology. The world of speculative fiction creates this magic circle where you can be more open-minded in thinking about, say, the implications of technology for future societies. And in general, it allows you to take on different personas, different perspectives, in ways that are quite different from your own real life experiences, because the rules of reality don't need to apply in games and often do not. That the persona you're embodying, the rules of interaction can be quite different in a game. And just by entering into that experience, your mindset automatically should shift to accepting what the game is giving to you in a more open-minded and receptive way through that safety of distancing. So that's often a strong rationale for why I'm drawn to using games and fiction in my work, because they create these alternative experiences where you can explore new ways of thinking about social issues like bias. Another example of fictionalization in our work, I mentioned the example of the Black Plague themed game. We did another game about health where we were trying to teach players about vaccination and disease spread. And we ended up coming up with a zombie skinned version of this game. So a game where you're doing things like deploying vaccinations in the game, but we compared the effectiveness of a zombie themed version to a more realistic version that simply depicted the game as being about disease spread in a neighborhood. And we did a randomized experiment where people either played the zombie version or the realistic version. And we found the zombie version was actually much more effective at changing outcomes, including empathy toward people with actual infectious diseases, in large part because the zombie skin version was much more immersive and transporting. When we measured how engaged or immersed players were by the game, the levels of immersion were significantly higher in the zombie version, even though the mechanics of the game were identical. So the zombie skin version gave sort of a distanced reality. So you can think about the metaphorical representations of things like disease and death in ways that didn't evoke some of the stronger negative emotions that confronting those topics might have. This is a tactic used by the CDC when they send out information to schools, for example, about disease spread. They often do use a zombie metaphor. They'll create graphic novels with zombie metaphors to represent disease as a way to teach it in a more accessible, approachable way. We found a similar level of success in this example of the board game about vaccination and disease spread. Current project we're working on, I'll talk a bit more in detail about, is called Bloomwood Stories Block Party. This is a visual novel game where players are making choices on behalf of their character that deals with experiences in healthcare. So in the game, players take on the role of community manager, where they're interacting with citizens in the neighborhood, giving them advice about how to navigate specific issues they're facing in regard to their physical or mental health, or their experiences with the healthcare system more generally. The underlying goal is to especially empower members of marginalized groups to sort of address or overcome specific either intrapersonal challenges to engaging with healthcare systems, or to confront sort of external examples of things like bias they might encounter in healthcare, and feel more empowered and a higher degree of self-efficacy in navigating healthcare issues. So in the game, the players who themselves, the target player is meant to be a member of these marginalized groups or some intersection of them. But in the game, they're playing the role of a manager who's giving advice to non-player characters in the game about how to navigate the issues. But the issues faced by the non-player characters are actually meant to some extent to echo or resonate with players with things they might either have experienced or have family members or friends who have experienced. So the game presents non-player characters of diverse ages and races, language groups, sexual orientations, etc. So chances are the more you interact with these characters, you're going to see some degree of relevance to at least some issue that you yourself might be vulnerable to or have faced in your own experiences. So as you play the game, you're interacting with all these characters, some of whom may have information or resources to share with others, or you might point people toward institutions like clinics or libraries to help navigate these issues. But you're basically giving them guidance on how to build up their sense of self-efficacy in healthcare. So you encounter different characters, you learn a bit about their background, their identity, their experience, and each character gives you sort of a quest that you're on, essentially, which culminates in you giving them advice on how to navigate a specific issue or topic. So Mrs. Lee, for example, has some level of lack of self-confidence with her language. She's English is a second language learner who has some issues with communication as she's learning English in a new cultural context. So you're trying to help her navigate that issue related to her identity in seeking help for a certain healthcare issue, in this case, chronic headaches. And so you have to figure out ways to offer advice that are mindful and sensitive to the specific needs and perspectives of these non-player characters. And so it uses distancing in the fact that you as the player are playing the role of a sort of expert. You're sort of guiding them toward resources, you're offering advice, you're modeling effective behaviors that we hope players would sort of internalize. So rather than putting players in the perspective of the character who's experiencing these issues, you have this more distanced point of view and giving advice to other characters that you might identify with or resonate with. And we found generally this is a really effective approach at making the game more accessible and approachable. Players emerge from the game feeling more empowered and a higher degree of self-efficacy in their own healthcare context because they've navigated these choices they have to make and thought about these different strategies of navigating these issues and seeking healthcare options or healthcare advice. And so that positioning of players as a community liaison who has some degree of expertise or knowledge about resources was empowering to players, and by and large made the game more approachable because of the psychological distancing that the game affords. One final example of distancing I'll mention is a brand new project we just started working on this semester. It's using fan fiction writing as a therapeutic tool for members of marginalized groups. In these studies, we're having members of marginalized groups, including LGBTQ plus teens and young adults, where they're writing about autobiographical experiences using fan fiction. So they're choosing a character from a known piece of fiction or universe to represent themselves and writing autobiographical stories using the character sort of as a proxy or a stand-in for themselves. And we're finding we've done some early work comparing the impact of writing a fan fiction account of your personal experiences versus a more realistic, literal passage about your experiences. And we found the distancing afforded by fan fiction led people to be more comfortable expressing especially sensitive aspects of their experience or their identity, or more consequential aspects of their identity or choices they're making. And they felt safer and more comfortable doing that, having the distance provided by the fan fiction framing. And currently we're developing a technology where we would pair authors with supporters of near peers that would provide advice and how to navigate those decisions that they might be writing about by writing themselves into the story as another character in that universe and giving advice through their character. So this collaborative fan fiction we're looking at to see what impact it has on mental health and perceptions of social support, especially looking at the advantages of a fan fiction approach versus a more straightforward, realistic, sort of expressive writing approach to talking about and processing your own subjective experiences. All right, I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to actually stop there and see if there are any questions in our last few minutes. Apologies for going a bit over time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please feel free to raise hands or type in the chat if you've got questions. One I'm just very briefly curious about is what are techniques for conveying this to game designers that succeed and fail? Like I'm most familiar with, as a researcher trying to convey ideas out to industry in sort of non-game scenarios. How do you do this well? You just go to GDC and share some of these ideas? Do are there other places? Like what works and what doesn't?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I typically find the most success in working as a consultant with game design teams or game designers who are working in the space of transformational games when they're early on in their process of thinking of their approach. So I often will invite them to articulate what their initial conception of their game might be, and then have them explore ways that these types of strategies might be relevant to the approach they're working with. So one example would be there was a team of students here at CMU creating a game about sexual assault and bystander intervention. And they made an initial version of the game. They sketched out through storyboards a version of the game where every encounter in the game involved some sexual assault being some undercurrent or a theme. And I very quickly said, well, what would it look like to use an intermixing approach here to sort of balance out some scenes that did involve this topic, but other scenes where you're getting to know the characters and maybe helping them navigate other types of challenges in their daily experience. So I found the most success in applying these strategies when I can actually show their benefit and with a real life example of a game design project early on in that process. Other cases, teams will come to me after the design is finished and say, well, we're not actually having success with this. We don't find players are actually gravitating toward our game, or we're not seeing the effect that we want. Then I will help them to revisit some of the choices they made to see if there's any benefit potentially of using some of these methods, whether it's shifting the setting using a more distancing approach or integrating more elements of humor or symbolism as a way to make the topic more approachable.
Yeah, it seems really fascinating here because many of your design techniques are effectively deployed via subtlety, which means that, it's not just a tool that I just insert into my game, and it requires some of the art and the science together. Huh.
Yeah, and that can be a message that can be hard to get across in some ways because it's somewhat counterintuitive in many instances where you might assume like taking a sort of a hammer approach to intervention where you present as much of that topic as you can and as forceful and obvious a way as you can might be the most effective approach. But I think either you see pretty quickly how that can backfire, especially in the context of game design, or you pivot to say, well, maybe this approach only works for an audience that already cares about this topic, for example. So they might pivot and say, well, I like the approach you've taken. It's very overt and very obvious, but maybe it'll only work for mobilizing people that already care about this topic and already motivated to take action. And so that I've seen that happen as well, where the designers might narrow the scope of who they're actually trying to target with their game based on the approach they've taken.
Yeah, I'm sure it's fascinating. It's like it's a general problem with design, right? That much of our knowledge is deeply contextual and very narrow, and applies only in narrow situations. Like you have near situations that, gosh,
yeah,
it's a challenge to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we're at time.
Yes.
Well, again, then thank you so much for joining us. Thunderous silent Zoom applause.